Good evening, Vili. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great.
And you?
I'm doing very well. Busy, but it keeps me out of trouble. So
Yeah, that's
yes,
good. Yeah.
I was very excited about the episode for today because it's one of my favorite topics, and it sort of features around the Sethian view and the interpretation around the sons of God in Genesis 6 and how they differ from each other. Would you like
Yeah,
to
yeah.
to get us started off and give me your opinion?
Yeah, so that's also basically two views regarding Genesis 6, verse 4, and that's how one interprets the sons of God. Now, the one view is that it refers to heavenly beings, angels, and the other view is that it refers to the Sethians, descendants from Adam's son Seth. So the question is, which one is the correct view? So the Sethian view basically says that the sons of God are the sons of Seth that intermarried with the daughters of Cain. So in this view, it's the sons of Seth that intermarried with the daughters of Cain. It's two human families that intermarried with each other. And the Nephilim, that's their offspring, in this case, they are not of superhuman descent, as in the other view, in which case their fathers are fallen angels. But in this
So it's
case,
basically the pure
they
sons
are
of
just
Seth
human.
with Cain's uh, sinful
Yeah, sinful
bloodline.
bloodline, the
Yes.
daughters of Cain. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know if it's very politically correct nowadays to say that, but anyway, um, yes. So, if you look at the two views, how old is the Sethian view as opposed to the Benai Elohim perspective?
Yeah, so the Sethian view is not that old. We first see that Seth is linked with the sons of God in about the time of Christ. Before that, we do not find that. Before that, we find, for example, in the book of Enoch, that the sons of God was understood as having reference to angels. We also find it in the Septuagint. We've discussed that in quite some detail in the first episode. And then also much earlier, the sons of God is actually a very old terminology, and we also find it in the Ugaritic texts. So it's very old, and we even find in the Bible, in the book of Jude, where Jude actually refers to the angels that did not keep their proper domain but left their abode, and that God has reserved them in everlasting chains. So in that case, it most likely also refers to those angels that in this view is talked about in chapter 6 of Genesis, because this whole passage is about sexual promiscuity. So this was a very old and established view that the sons of God refer to the angelic beings, and also because in the way that the terminology is used in the Bible, for the most part, it's used in terms of the divine counsel.
Yeah.
In the book of Job, for example, and also in other places, for example, Psalm 82, for example. So the sons of God, in that case, Psalm 22, they are referred to as the sons of the Most High, but it's exactly the same kind of terminology. So these are all the reasons why it has been interpreted. That's basically the traditional view, why they people that interpret this passage as or believed that the sons of God actually refers to angels. Now, the other view, actually, we first see this view in the time of Christ, as I've already mentioned. The Sethian Gnostics, for example, had a view in which the Sethians were combined in some way with the Nephilim. We find the same with Philo, the Jewish philosopher.
Yep.
He also linked Seth or the Sethians with the Nephilim. And we also find it with Josephus. That is actually extremely interesting that Josephus does this. So what he says, I can actually read the passage from Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, 2.3.
Yes.
He says that now this prosperity of Seth continued to esteem God as the Lord of the universe and to have an entire regard to virtue for 7 generations. But in process of time, they were perverted. And then a little bit further on, he continues, for many angels of God accompanied with women and begat sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that was good on account of the confidence they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians call giants.
Yes.
So clearly he refers to the Nephilim. But what is interesting in this case, what he's saying is that for 7 generations, the Sethians were virtuous. But then the Sethian girls slept
Yes.
with the angels.
Yep.
So he doesn't have the traditional view at this point in time. So, but this is the point in history, more or less, during just after the time of Christ, that we first see that Seth is linked to the Nephilim. So this is quite an interesting development.
Yeah. And then
that we see at this stage in history.
I might just sort of quickly interject here and just sort of also point to the fact that if you look at the writings of Julius Africanus, that's one of the places where the Sethian view first appears. That was around the 3rd century. And then it was sort of systematized by Saint Augustine in the City of God. And you get the idea that they basically try to distance the Christian doctrine from Jewish angelology and pagan mythologies. But that's just sort of my perspective on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's only during the 4th century that it became widespread in Christian circles and accepted as, the sort of orthodox view, but not before that time.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. And then just sort of taking a step back, looking at the whole terminology around the Benai Elohim, it's not just in Genesis that term is used. I mean, it's featured in the Bible, and it's always it always points to the sons of God. Which, I mean, you can bring in the divine counsel at that point as well. So did you want to expand a bit on that?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, they're often linked with the divine counsel. So the question is actually, why do we find in the Sethian view that the Nephilim is linked with the Sethians? This is, not something that you find in the Bible, or is it? That's the question.
Yes, there you go.
And it is actually, it is actually found in the Bible. That's in Numbers 24. There's a passage, and this is also the passage that Josephus uses in his explanation. And this is the prophecy of Balaam, and he says, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of Tumult. And Edom shall be his possession, Seir also, his enemies, shall be a possession." Now, Seir, that's just another name for Edom. And this is also a term used by Josephus because he refers to the pillars that stood in the land of Seirat, which he acts is just a reference to Seir, this land. And the reason why the Sethians feature in this passage is that tumult is the Hebrew word is Sheth.
Yes.
And the Hebrew interpreters linked that. So the sons of tumult, they understood this as the sons of Seth. And because they understood this passage as a reference to the biblical Seth, the son of Adam, there's actually no connection between the two because these are just the sons of tumult that lived in the land of Edom.
Yeah.
And because the Edomites were at this stage definitely linked, or later on definitely linked with the Nephilim, it so happened that they linked these two and believed that this passage referred to the sons of Seth. And Josephus understood this is in the 7th generation, the daughters of Seth slept with angels. And this is why their descendants became Nephilim.
Yeah.
And later on, the Sethian view took on a kind of life of its own. And that's when the Sethians were later on, paired with the daughters of Cain and so forth, and all those theories that developed. But this was the basis for linking the Sethians with the Nephilim. And we can immediately see that this is very wrong. This is not a good way to approach the text. And the Sons of Seth is actually not in this passage. And to understand it in this way is just wrong. It was a late development. And this is basically why the view that the Nephilim, that links the Nephilim to the Sons of Seth and the Sons of God being Sethians, just cannot endure.
Yes. Absolutely. And it's, I mean, if you look at all of your writings where he does refer to the Sethian sort of approach, it is exegetically inadequate. It's sort of, when you look at the Sethian approach or the Sethite approach, it's almost like you're trying to find extra justification or reasons for why you're using that. It just doesn't fit comfortably. And I know that's going to upset a couple of people, but it's almost like it forces that unnatural reading of the syntax and that rhetorical contrast. Thanks for that. Anything else to add to that?
No, I think this is the main reason.
Yes.
I want you to understand why where the link originated between the Sethians and the Nephilim. Yeah. This is the main question. How did it happen that some link was conceived by those early writers? But none of the early writers, not the Gnostics, the Sethian Gnostics, neither Josephus, neither Philo, saw this link between the Sethians and the Nephilim as it later developed in Jewish and in Christian circles. In terms of what has become known as the Sethian view.
Yes.
This was even a later development, But the original link, that's where it happened. It was just before Christ, sort of in that period, that that the link was first made between the Sethians and the Nephilim because of this passage.
Yeah, and it's good when you look at this and you look at the timelines, you can say or clearly see that this is a later perspective, so you should take a step back to what was the view prior to that. But I want to throw a curveball your way. What would you say is the key differences between the Sethian view and the fallen angels view in explaining the Nephilim's origin?
Yeah, so I think what is important here is that, with regard to the Sethian view, we don't have a supernatural dimension to the story. Yeah. So angels is not involved, And in the other view, angels are involved. And this means that fallen angels and the devil, Lucifer, and the fallen angels, those that followed Lucifer in the rebellion against God, this basic story that we find throughout the Bible of conflict between the devil and his angels, the fallen angels, and God and his angels. Now the Nephilim also plays a role in that. So this story implies that the Nephilim forms an important part of the whole theology, biblical theology. Yes. And it should be understood as an important aspect of this greater story. And especially when we get to the book of Revelation, we'll come back to that. But again, the Nephilim features, and we'll have a few things to say about that later on. So we should not, the moment that we do not see any supernatural aspect to the Nephilim, they do not form part of this part of the biblical story. And I think that is actually quite important.
Yes, absolutely. So to just take it and sort of condense it into one sentence. So the key difference is you've got your human lineage versus a supernatural divine breach of boundaries, if I can call it that. And it has very different theological consequences. And it sort of it really changes your perspective on how you read the Bible, because now suddenly with the Sethite view, it's almost that there's a bit of fragmentation, whereas when you look at the Benai Elohim view, you pick up on that golden thread that runs right from Genesis through to the book of Revelation.
Yeah, and also, the mother promise that we find in Genesis chapter 3, it's often overlooked, but we do read about the seed of the serpent.
Yes.
And that implies descendants, because the seed of the woman is usually understood as having reference to the Messiah. So if we read both aspects of that verse in the same way, it implies that there must be a seed of the serpent, which is usually understood in terms of the Nephilim and Nephilim lineages and even Nephilim messiahs. And I believe that the Antichrist eventually will be from Nephilim lineage. So the Nephilim plays an extremely important part in the story from the earliest of times. The moment that religion comes into play and that we think in supernatural terms, then the Nephilim is actually an important part of that story throughout history.
Yes, absolutely. It just makes sense. So that, we're talking about the flood. That brings me to the flood. Can we have a bit of a discussion around the Nephilim pre-flood and post-flood, according to the 9 ages?
Yeah, so in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, we read that the Nephilim were on the earth before and after the deluge. So they were also on the earth after the deluge. And we actually find them later on in Canaan in the form of giants. In Numbers, they are referred to. It's only those 2 passages in the Bible that refers to the Nephilim directly, actually. There's other more indirect via the Rephaim, etc. But it's only those 2 passages. So the question is, how did the Nephilim from before the deluge ended up in the period after the deluge? Now, the only person in the book of Genesis, in the primeval history, that's in Genesis 1 to 11, that is clearly described as a man of renown, because this is how the Nephilim are actually described in Genesis 6 verse 4, as men of old, men of renown. And the only one is Nimrod.
Yes.
So it seems that the biblical author did have Nimrod in mind, and it was understood that he was part of the Nephilim. The problem is, it doesn't seem that he had a supernatural birth, and that he was from a certain lineage, the lineage of Ham, and his father was Kish, and Kish's father was Ham, and the son of Noah. So that implies the possibility that actually this lineage came through with the Noah family. Maybe Noah, Ham's mother or Ham's wife was from Nephilim descent, and that has often been proposed in history, and that's, I think, a real possibility. So they were actually a family, a dynasty, the ruling dynasty of Uruk in Sumer that the Bible speaks about. The kingdom of Nimrod. That was actually a Nephilim dynasty.
Yes.
So I think that's a possible way to link the pre and post flood families of Nephilim descent.
Yeah, and if you look at it, if you read the 9 ages, and I recommend everybody do, there's that continuous tradition that moves right through these very distinct historical ages. I mean, if we take a step back and we look at the Sumerian king list, you've got Gilgamesh, you've got Dumuzi that were expressing themselves as divine. So would you say there was a bit of a dilution, if we talk about size?
Yes. So two things are important. On the one hand, we do have a continuous tradition of families that claimed divine descent. And that was continuous tradition linked with continuous bloodlines, certain families throughout history that claimed that kind of descent.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there was the Tower of Babel kind of events, which in my book, in the first volume of the Nephilim, I show that there was also events in the post-Diluvian period where such Nephilim could have been fathered, and we'll come back to that.
Yep.
But that's also a close link with the Sumerian tradition, because in the Sumerian tradition we find that the house of Uruk, which is clearly the same dynasty as the one that's been described in the Bible and in which Nimrod plays an important role, that this dynasty is said to have been descended from the gods. So we find it very clearly in this case, that this dynasty is descended from the gods. And if you take the parallel into account, we've spoken about that in the previous podcast that we did about the Sumerian hypothesis. So if you take that into account, it seems that that's a further support for the view that this lineage was definitely, they believed themselves to have been descended from the gods, which the Sons of God is just another term than gods in the old terminology.
So the size and giantness diminishes, but those cultural, ritual features remain. So sacred kingship, claims to divine descent, elite secret knowledge, all of that. Very,
exactly.
very interesting. Yes. Yeah. Great. Awesome answer. So, Willie, this is going to be an interesting one. What evidence do we see that Noah's daughter-in-law carried the Nephilim genetics? And I know there's some different theories around it, and I wouldn't say anything concrete, but that's always intrigued me. So there were giants in the earth on those days and after the flood.
So I think the main reason for believing that is, as I've just mentioned, the similarities between the biblical and the extra-biblical traditions. The Sumerian tradition also refers to the same dynasty, the dynasty of Uruk.
Yeah.
And in the biblical tradition, they are called, or we see clearly that Nimrod, which was a ruler of Uruk and part of that dynasty, that he was, or is described as a Nephilim. And then at the same time, we see that that very same family in Sumer was also understood to have been descendants of the gods, or to have been Nephilim. So we have parallel traditions saying exactly the same thing. So I believe, according to the Sumerian hypothesis, that this was a shared tradition. The ancestors of Abram also lived in Sumer from the earliest of times. Semites lived in that region. And this was a shared tradition that this particular family was descended from the gods. And we find that in both Sumerian as well as early Israelite tradition, that it was handed down in both groups, in both circles. So I think that's quite strong support that, there was an authentic tradition in this regard in the earlier period.
Absolutely. There must have been some post-flood carryover. And two things that I always wonder about. I mean, we get handed Goliath of Gad and his brothers, and then we look at Og of Bashan as well.
That's
so
right.
Those are post-flood.
And we'll come to them. We'll discuss them in detail.
Absolutely. It's just throwing out those little interesting things. So. Our sort of last point is, what were the beliefs of the Nephilim bloodlines regarding reincarnation, and how would you tie that in with the heavenly code?
So I think what is important is maybe also, before we get to this, I think what we should also look into is, why the Sethian view originated. And I'll come back to answer your question, but what is important is the reason why there was this preference to exclude the possibility of angels marrying or having sexual relations with the daughters of men, with humans, is that we do find in the Bible, for example, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, that Jesus says, in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. So in this view, it's believed that the angels cannot have carnal relations with humans. So this implies, or this is a kind of conflict situation with what we find in the book of Genesis, in chapter 6. Now, what is interesting is, again, if we can go back to the Sumerian way of understanding things. So this is extremely important. How did the Sumerians, understood this descent from the angels? So what happened is, over and above the fact that they believed that the house of Uruk were descended from the gods, they also believed that there was a certain point, and that happened through the sacred marriage, that certain angelic or spiritual beings fathered humans, fathered children with the daughters of men, and that happened via the sacred marriage. So what they believed was, for example, in the case of Gilgamesh, we find this extremely interesting passage in the Sumerian king list. It says, divine Gilgamesh, he was actually 2/3 divine, according to the Sumerian view. His father was a Lilu diamond, so he was a spiritual being.
Yes.
But then at the same time, if we read further on, a high priest of Kulab, that was at Uruk.
Yes.
So his father was a high priest, his mother was a high priestess. But what we do find here is, in some way, this spiritual being possessed his father during the marital act. Yeah. And it was in this way that Gilgamesh was fathered, and that this happened. So it was not really a spiritual being that manifested himself and had a carnal relation with a woman in the Sumerian and very, very early tradition.
Yes.
That tradition actually originated with the Babylonians much later. And the recasting of this early tradition about Gilgamesh. So what is extremely important is to understand that the early Sumerian tradition was quite different.
Yes.
And that also explains things in a different light. I'm agnostic as to how these things happened.
Yes.
It's not for me to say what is the possibilities in the supernatural realm, but the point of the matter is just that a different view.
Yeah.
And it's also important to take that into account.
Absolutely. And just to sort of take a step into theology, if you do look at, that phrase that we're not given into marriage, I have to emphasize, Paul calls marriage a mystery in Ephesians 5, verse 31 to 32. He says, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. So if you look at that, it says marriage is not an end in itself, but a sign pointing to something greater. So it's something that gets fully realized in eternity. So that union between God and his people. So just to correct that, because we did have a question about that. And I think sometimes we miss the solid theology around certain things.
So now we can come back to your question about reincarnation. So the Sumerians did believe that through this sacred marriage, it was possible to reincarnate the gods on earth.
Yes.
So they believed that certain gods, for example, there are different examples. The one is, for example, the 7 gods. So they associated the 7 stars of the Pleiades constellation. They associated those stars with gods, and they called them the 7 gods. And that they believed, as I discussed in some detail in my first volume, they believe that these 7 gods were reincarnated through the sacred marriage on earth in the form of 7 young men that accompanied Lugalbanda, which is also sometimes regarded as the father of Gilgamesh. He's described as a great shamanistic figure. And his 7 sons, and the 7 young men, but it seems to be the Sumerian tradition upheld that they were his sons. And they were regarded as the earthly incarnations of the 7 gods in heaven.
Yes.
So we do find that tradition definitely among the Sumerians. We also find the Apkallu, the wise, the sages, the tradition about the sages, the 7 unnamed sages. That's important. It's not the named sages. That's a major difference. Not later on in the Syrian tradition and so on, but we now are really talking about the earliest traditions.
And they feature,
the earliest traditions.
It features in Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian tradition. So it's
in the earliest in the Sumerian tradition.
Yeah.
So the sages were a group that lived before the deluge as well as after the deluge. But we're talking about a group of 7 nameless sages. And it's they that, for example, is linked with Gilgamesh, and they advised him with regard to the building of the great walls of Uruk, where he became king at some point.
Yeah.
So they were also supernaturally born, according to tradition, from the waters in some way. So it seems that they had some, it's probably the early structure that they built in the Persian Gulf, in the area of Eridu, where we later on found the earliest sanctuary in ancient Sumer. It was probably in this regard and in the cultic rituals at that site that they were fathered. So we have that very clear tradition. And then we also have a similar kind of tradition in the Bible. For example, in the book of Revelation, at the end, we read that the beast, he was, in the time of the author of Revelation, St. John, he was before his time. Then he says, in this time he is not. He's clearly at that point. Is he in the pit?
Yes.
In the abyss, where he's locked up. And then he's released later on. And he says he will return. And then he will do all those very bad things that we associate with the Antichrist. And there's a lot of spirits with him that's also released.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Yep.
So there's no doubt that, or in my mind, and I discussed that in detail in the 3rd volume of the Nephilim, that this actually refers to the return of the Nephilim. The Nephilim will also return.
Yeah.
So this is a fascinating topic, and again, we're talking about a certain kind of reincarnation, even in terms of biblical tradition.
Yes.
Because we should make a clear distinction between humans and human spirits that will not be reincarnated.
Yes.
And these Nephilim spirits, which is in the Bible especially called the Rephaim in different contexts, and they are, even in terms of their death, they are described as separate from the rest of humankind. Yes. And we find, for example, in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, how they, in the deepest abyss, parts of the abyss, how they raise when their king enters.
Yes.
And their king is then the same king that we read about in Revelation, that's kept in the abyss and will be released. The angel of the abyss, that's what he's called in that passage. But we'll return to that and we'll discuss that in some detail.
Absolutely. And in the future, I'd like us to touch more on the Apkallu, created by the god Enki, the god of wisdom and magic. And, they were...
Yeah, his name means the Lord of the earth.
Absolutely. And
he stood against the supreme God from the earliest of times in ancient Sumerian tradition. Yeah.
But before we go into a deeper discussion about that, because it's so interesting, I want to thank you for your time today. It was really fascinating. I loved the discussion, and I'm looking forward to the next podcast.
Yeah, so it was wonderful, and maybe I will also just ask the readers to remember about the books. That's all the things that we're discussing They can also find this lots and lots of information in the trilogy that I have written, and it's explained in much greater depth in those books. And and they must join our community and become involved and ask questions, and we would like to answer them. Yeah,
even if it's difficult ones.
yeah.
Thank you, Willie.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Bye.